Hey everyone, it's Kenji, and we're gonna make some clam chowder. So we're doing this the easy way with canned clams and bottled clam juice, which is actually one of my favorite forms of bottled stock. I'm gonna start by sauteing some aromatics. So I got my pot here. Canned clams I think are great, especially for a thing like this. You can of course use live clams, cherry stones or quahogs, or even something like a Pacific razor clam. And if you want to do that, I've got a recipe I will link to down below. But I'm doing this the quick and easy way. This is like the 20-minute version, maybe even less. I guess 20 minutes including simmering and stuff. All right, we're gonna start with an onion. You could use a leek if you want. So this is, by the way, New England style clam chowder. I was born in New England, born in Boston, grew up in New York, but my dad lived in Boston. And for my whole, basically since I was like 12 years old, my dad lived in Boston, so I spent a lot of time between here and there, between New York and there. And I used to love clam chowder. I mean, I still do, but I used to also. New England style, so this is the sort of, the creamy kind, although a lot of times New England style clam chowder, especially when you get it outside of like New England, can be super thick and floury. And I used to really dislike that kind, but it's basically all you can get on the West Coast now, where like a real traditional New England style clam chowder is actually relatively thin. It's not thick enough that you can stand a spoon in it. It's relatively thin, milky, but lots of clam flavor. But I actually don't mind the really thick stuff either. Sometimes I even prefer it. All right, so you can, if you want, start with something like salt pork or bacon instead of just butter, but you don't have to. I think very, very traditional New England style clam chowder would actually have salt beef, I believe. I might be wrong on that. I definitely wrote about it, and this is one of those things where, one of those like Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade things where I wrote about it so I don't have to remember it. So if you look at the article that I link below, I'm sure I've written about it there. But it was a dish that was made with preserved meat, so either salt pork or salt beef, hardtack, so like a really thick biscuit, like if you think of like lembas bread, from like Lord of the Rings, the elves bread, think of something like that, biscuits that you would put into a pot. So fishermen would bring it on their boat. They'd get a pot with hardtack and salt beef, and then they would add shellfish to it, and then simmer it all together, and the biscuits would actually sort of thicken up the soup into a chowder. I think that's sort of the origins of clam chowder. Of course, modern clam chowder has dairy, generally is thickened with flour, but you still do crackers in them. All right, so I got my onions going. I'm also gonna get some celery in there. So to do celery, I cut lengthwise down the stalk like that, and then just crosswise. And if you have trouble cutting fully lengthwise down like that, you can first cut it crosswise into sort of shorter pieces, and then cut each one of those lengthwise, and that'll make it a lot easier to do if you find that you're having trouble cutting it lengthwise like that. Celery stalk, could go with 2 if you wanted. All right, so our goal here is to sweat this out, but not brown it at all. We don't want any sort of sweetness creeping in on those onions. So not looking to brown it at all, just want to sweat it out and get those vegetables softened. So very moderate heat and frequent stirring. All right, meanwhile, I'm gonna get my potato ready. This is a russet potato. You could also use a Yukon Gold, or whatever potatoes you have. In the recipe I have linked below, what I do in that one is I cook the potatoes along with the clams and everything, and then the potato starch kind of thickens up the chowder. The issue that happens when you do that is that usually the chowder breaks, so it turns like a little greasy and clumpy, curdly. And so you end up having to kind of, I think in that recipe what I do is I drain everything, blend the soup base, and then put all the solid ingredients back in, which is something we used to do at when I was a cook at B&G Oysters in Boston. That's how we made our chowder there. I don't know if they still do that, but the easier way to do it is to just rely on flour to thicken your chowder, and then cook your potatoes separately. Actually, I'm not going to need this whole potato, probably just half of that. That's a really big potato. Half of that potato's enough, I think. So I'm going to cook my potatoes separately on the side and then kind of stir them into the chowder at the end and let them do their final bit of simmering in the chowder. All right, our vegetables are pretty soft now. By the way, this same sort of process is what I would do whether I'm making a corn chowder or a clam chowder or a potato chowder, bacon and potato chowder, something like that. I would start with the same onion and celery base and do basically everything the same, except instead of clams, I would add corn and corn stock or chicken stock instead of clam juice. But the rest of the process, pretty much the same. It's kind of like a blueprint for chowder. All right, now some flour. I'm gonna go relatively thick on this one, actually. Just feeling like it today. So, I don't know, that's probably like a quarter cup of flour, 4 tablespoons of flour, something like that. We're gonna go like not quite as thick as like a, like a bechamel, a white sauce, but still pretty thick. So for a quarter cup of flour, I'm gonna add about, so basic bechamel ratio would be about a tablespoon of flour per cup of liquid. I don't know what that is in grams, and grams would be whatever. For 240 milliliters of liquid, a tablespoon of flour. I don't know what a tablespoon of flour is in grams. Probably 15 grams. No, it can't be that much. 10 grams, say. Anyhow, so I'm going to do this for about a cup of clam juice and 4 cups of milk. So a little bit lower ratio than a bechamel would be. Why don't you open? There you go. So we're just going to stir this in and incorporate that flour, that roux. I know Chef John fans there know that you can probably just dump in all your cold liquid at once and it'll come out just smooth anyway. I find that adding a little at a time is actually easier for me. It's easier to get everything to dissolve. It's easier to make sure that there's no clumps of flour. So I prefer to add it in this way. But if you found success doing it the Chef John way, then by all means, just dump it all in at once and you're fine. All right, so we got our clam juice in there. Clam juice, great in a Bloody Mary. All right. And about 4 cups of milk. Is that right? Now we're just going to let this come to a simmer. If I had some thyme sprigs, I would probably throw them in there too, but I don't. I'm going to go with a couple bay leaves, and then some canned clams. Canned clams are kind of like, like canned tuna is really, it's good. It's different from fresh tuna, of course, but it's good in its own way. And canned clams are also one of those things that's really good, different from fresh clams, but in a thing like this where you're cooking it all down together, it works just fine. So these are chopped clams. You can also use, you can get cans of whole clams and then chop them yourself. What I would avoid is the minced clams, because those usually have very, very tiny pieces. All right. A couple of cans of clams. And all I'm going to do now is I'm going to let this come up to a simmer and let it simmer away while my potatoes cook until they're softened, and then I'll incorporate everything. You know what? I am going to use that whole potato now that I see how much chowder I'm making. We'll make this a nice chunky one. Change my mind. I don't even know what I would do with this half a potato anyway if I didn't throw it in here. So. Sometimes ratios matter in cooking, and sometimes they don't. Like in this recipe, the ratio of flour, oops, I just did the thing I said I wouldn't do. In this recipe, the ratio of flour to milk and stuff matters, but the ratio of potato to liquid is just what you want it to be. All right, so I accidentally dumped some of my potatoes in there anyway. So we'll see if this breaks because of that, but probably not. It was only a little bit of the potato that got in there. So we'll see. I'm sure it's going to be tasty either way. All right, so I'm just going to let these potatoes come up to a simmer. Season them, of course. I'll let them come to a simmer, and then I will see you again when they are soft. So that should take about 8 minutes or so. All right, so my potatoes are basically cooked. And my thing is simmering. I forgot those cans actually have quite a bit of liquid in them, so I ended up with a little bit less flour in here than I wanted, so it's not quite as thick as I wanted. So I'm going to actually I'm going to add a little more flour. Now, I know technically you're supposed to cook flour in fat, make a roux before you add it, so you don't get what people say is like a raw flour flavor. I've probably even said that before, but honestly, you can make a slurry like this and it'll work just fine, especially if you're gonna simmer it for a little while after. So I'm gonna add this. That's just a little bit more flour that I'm adding in a slurry to thicken this up a little bit better. And of course, it is gonna reduce a little bit as it continues to simmer, so it'll get even thicker than that. So it'll be somewhere between what you get in Seattle, like super, super thick chowder, and a more typical New England style, which is a little thinner. Get my potatoes in there. So the potatoes were basically al dente, which is not generally what you go for with potatoes. You want pasta al dente, but potatoes fully cooked. But they're going to continue simmering in this pot a tiny bit so that they can absorb some of the flavor from that clam and clam juice, and everything gets to know each other a little better. And luckily, it looks like none of this broke. That small amount of potato I added in there earlier was not enough to make this break or turn grainy or anything. It's actually looking really nice and smooth. So we're going to quite a bit of black pepper. I like a lot of pepper in my chowder. Pepper and hot sauce. I usually get hot sauce at the table. Like Tabasco I like in chowder. Tabasco is not my favorite hot sauce, but I do really like it in chowder for some reason. All right, let's taste for seasoning. You notice I barely added any salt this so far. I added some to the potato water and a little bit to the onions and celery while they were sauteing, but not too much because that clam juice is actually pretty salty, as is the canned clams, but this could use a little pinch more. All right, we'll just let this simmer down for maybe 5 more minutes to get those potatoes fully softened and to the texture that we want everything, and then we're ready for lunch. My family's not home right now, but I think my daughter and my wife are at the zoo, but they will have clam chowder waiting for them when they get home. All right, I'll see you in just about 5 more minutes. All right, you ready? Ready for a little bit chowder now? Here we go. So the potatoes got nice and soft. I think they're best when their edges are starting to break down, but they still have that sort of bite in the core. Look at this. It's like hot ocean milk with dead animal croutons. What's the other quote from The Good Place? It's like like a savory latte with bugs in it. It's a good show. All right, final thing, oyster crackers. These are Nabisco oyster crackers, which are not my oyster cracker of choice, but it's what I had. I would go for Westminster oyster crackers, which are sort of the classic New England ones. A little bit extra pepper there to pump up the clam. All right. That is some chowder. Not too thin, not too thick. Oh, by the way, you can, if you want this a little bit richer, you can cut this, cut the milk with some half and half or heavy cream. A lot of people like to do that. I find the milk on its own is just fine. Clam chowder and milkshakes. Those are two New England things that, as they left New England, became much thicker. Like the original milkshake in New England is thin milk. It's milk and a syrup that's shaken, and what the rest of the world calls milkshakes in New England are fraps. Canned clam. So what did this take? 20 minutes? Something like that? Maybe 25? Whew, hot. Here, you want a cracker? Oh, this chicken's here because I was shooting some stuff for my book. Sit. Good girl. I had to pick up some photos for my walk book, which is not out yet, but it's coming out in March, and there's a few photos missing, including a section on how to break down a chicken, so that's what I was doing. All right. Guys, gals, non-binary pals, I will see you next time. Bye-bye.